My name is Kloetzke, and I presented here at the Ozark Mountain UFO Conference a talk about the elongated skulls of Peru. The topic of the skulls has been really a huge mystery for many, many decades and have captured the imagination of a lot of researchers and investigations. And we were really excited about being able to go down to Peru and put hands on and boots on the ground investigating these anomalous skulls. Probably my favorite thing about the investigation is the fact that we had professional equipment with us, and for the first time, the scientific protocols, the permissions from the Ministry of Culture, as well as all the supplies we needed for proper DNA analysis. This is the first time. It's never been done. And this is important. In 1927, Tilo was an archaeologist and one of the most noted, found these incredible bundles of mummies in a necropolis near Pisco. And this was a huge discovery. What was shocking about what he was uncovering was they were different than the indigenous mummies and the indigenous peoples of Peru that had been discovered in the past. They were buried in bundles, and when they were unwrapped, they discovered they were a little taller than the indigenous peoples, as well as red hair, and most of them had these enormous elongated skulls. The investigation included hands-on examination and deep scrutiny into some of the anomalies of the skulls. So we understand that elongated skulls and the cranial deformation and cradle boarding was a practice done in Peru. So the elongated skulls are not as unusual, but there was a small percentage of skulls that presented these characteristics that were completely divergent from the other skulls and human skulls. Example of our inventory list of the skulls we're most interested in were the skulls with the larger than normal cranial capacity, the red hair, definitely the lack of a sagittal suture, and we were most interested in with the foramen magnum, that is the hole near the occipital plate where your spinal column goes into, and it's really the base of the body. We noticed on some of the skulls that this foramen magnum was located closer to the back of the head. So this made a big impact on part of our theory, because this change doesn't happen with manual manipulation. This change can only be a birthright, and it's different. And with the elongated skull and the foramen magnum, the lack of the sagittal suture and the larger capacity really points to something that is unusual. And we wondered if this was maybe a hybrid race or even a different race that the Paracas people emulated and move forward basically with, they just were not indigenous. These components of these skulls are very, very significant. So these were the inventories that we were looking for. And for every 300, 350 skulls we look at, we'd find one or two that had all of the anomalies. And these were the skulls that were selected for DNA sampling. It was extraordinary process being down there. We basically had to plan everything in the United States before we even got to Peru, a lot of the supplies we needed and the processes that we had to take for our DNA samples to not only be worthy and ready for analysis, but also to be probative at the end. We met the criteria of the Institute of Justice as well as the National Institute of Science and Technology. And these are the protocols that led us into exactly how we were going to do this. One of the first things we did in the process was to set up a sterile area. And this was a very small place because we needed lack of access. Once we put up the tape as a perimeter, the only personnel or the people allowed in this place were the investigators, and only in clean suits. People weren't allowed to come in and out, and our workspace was confined in movement, so we weren't walking around putting up dust that could possibly contaminate the osteology powder we were extracting. So it was an egregious process. It was difficult, and it was challenging on many levels. Part of even planning to go to Peru with this equipment was also, how are we going to have the samples taken out? In other words, we had to follow state and federal postal codes. We had to follow border patrol, customs. There was a long list of people that we had to make sure that their rules and policies and the organizations and administrations that they were responsible for in getting these samples back home were all satisfied. It was difficult, but it was worth every step, and we took not one shortcut or took out one level of that process. The result of this was every sample that we submitted was viable for testing with no contamination. That was a huge win for us, especially when we were dealing with skulls that had been handled probably 1,000 times. So by digging into the bone itself and extracting the osteology material in the middle and closer to the place where it couldn't be touched or contaminated, we were able to grab worthy DNA samples. The results were amazing. And I think part of this big reveal, or the big shocking bomb that went off, for lack of a better word, was because the majority of the skulls, the DNA, their origins came from the Middle East. This means this is not an indigenous people of Peru. They were migrants. And of course, the dating process goes back 500 years before. It was pre-Columbian. The migration was almost impossible according to the scientific standards of today. So how did they get there? Well, it isn't just about the DNA testing. It's about also understanding that the textiles that are found with the skulls are so advanced. It's the loom wasn't supposed to be available at this time, and yet the detail we can barely reproduce today by hand. The pottery and some of the artifacts. And we have to remember the megalithic structures, the cyclopean architecture all over Peru and Bolivia, in places such as Machu Picchu and Tiahuanaco, Pumapuku. Where did this advanced engineering come from? Because one thing's very clear. When you're there and studying some of the anomalies of these megalithic structures, it is clear that this was not done with chicken bones and copper tools. There was an intelligence behind this. This was an operating, sophisticated society that understood sacred geometry. They understood astrology, the astronomy, the stars, the heavens. And of course, the oral culture is that these beings came from the heavens, or they came from the stars. So with all of this in play and evidence of this advanced artifacts and this advanced culture, and then we're finding these skulls that are different than the other elongated skulls that are clearly manually manipulated, it brings us to a theory of, were these beings hybrids, or were these beings possibly extraterrestrials? Could they be supernaturals or biblical, such as angels? So it's really quite intriguing, but we have to consider the phenotyping, which is you bring in the environment and the clues we get from the evidence of their culture, and we put that with the elongated skulls that are different, and we wonder if this is one of the reasons that emulation from the rest of the population became very popular to do. Because the one thing we also understand about elongated skulls, only the royals were allowed to do this, or the free people. The slaves were not allowed to elongate their skulls, which is why we continue to find normal human skulls, skulls that are elongated but clearly manipulated, and then there's that small percentage that we're still trying to determine who they were and where did they come from. The smaller percentage were clearly, the DNA came back coming from the Middle East, the majority of them. And that fits right into the hypothesis of L.A. Marzulli that this was definitely the divergent race of giants that were exiled basically by Joshua, and that story can be read in the Torah. It could be a story or it can be viewed as a historical document. If you view some of these older texts, such as the Book of Enoch or, the Torah as historical text, it's actually very surprising the trail of evidence we find behind this. Everything from, the Great Deluge, the Great Flood, to this hybrid being on this earth that these older texts call giants. The land bridge is the standard, and this new discovery challenges that as the only theory. So the Beringian land only theory is no longer even plausible, and this isn't anyone but the DNA talking. This is a scientific test that has been blind studied and duplicated, and science doesn't care what we believe. The tests are real, and the scrutiny. So we're just in the beginning stages. We had 58 samples tested. That is more than admissible collection and comparison in a study group. However, we'd love to get back down there. The carbon dating is a little more difficult, and we only have so much money. There has been tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars already invested from when LA started almost 6 years ago into today. And we just don't have unlimited funding, unfortunately. So we're very choosy on what skulls and our best evidence forward. And there was a lot of scrutiny and a lot of professional discussion in exactly how we needed to perform these collections. Because honestly, we knew we only had one shot. Since this is, kind of our pilot program, there's absolutely enough evidence to challenge the scientific normal, but we also have enough to further our studies and to go back and look deeper, grab more DNA. It'd be nice to have access to maybe not just the skull, but, to measure the bodies, which are often not with the head or the skulls. So we really are planning on going back. A lot of study needs to still be done. And I think it's important to remind everyone that I'm not saying this. LA and the team, we're not proclamating, we're not trying to convince anybody. The science did it for us. The science is certain. And again, it doesn't it doesn't care what we believe. So for us, it has to be done right, done once, and we're ready to go forward. We're excited about it. There's been a few changes from the last time I was here at Ozark, and there are some things that haven't changed. But a couple of the things that have changed was I have become a registered lobbyist for the UFO field, and without knowing at the time that I was also going to be soon moving to Washington, D.C. with my husband. And it turned out to be one of the biggest blessings for a lot of reasons, but mostly when we moved there, This is just as all of this was breaking about ATIP and the Pentagon and, the unit that was investigating UFOs. And I couldn't have been in a better place at a better time. The lobbying effort that I'm going forward with is to ask about more programming. Luis Elizondo, the head of this UFO unit, for lack of a better word, basically has said that he doesn't believe, and he is certain that this program has not ended. And I really would like to know more about that. And that's what I'm pushing forward in DC. I'd like to know where the funding is, who's running it. Does it continue to be contracted through the Defense Intelligence Agency to the Pentagon? How is this all working? And I also want to maintain being an ombudsman for, a lot of our witnesses that may need to know if there's still some documents or forms that we can have released and declassified that could better prove their case, or could even satisfy their knowledge, or wondering, for decades, was this real that I saw? And of course, any kind of proof to them means everything. So this is really what I'm doing, that my objective in DC is to really work within the system, which DC is crazy. They have their own set of rules. And I just realized that as a UFO community, we have picketed the White House. We have petitioned the White House. And we've had 2 very important citizens hearing on disclosure. And we're no further along than we would have been. I believe these were important things that had happened and may have pushed us maybe a little closer to understanding. But without our lawmakers and the people that are actually responsible for declassifying information, or the people that are responsible for acknowledging dark programs and the funding for that, I just don't think we're going to get full disclosure. Why would they? We demand full disclosure. We have to remember what we're asking for. We're asking for over 70 years of information of a cover-up perpetrated on the citizens of the United States. Who's going to want to admit that and come out on that with all the other drama going on? And yet part of what I'd like to pursue and educate in DC and with the Senate and the House is basically that Chile openly admits and investigates UFOs through their government. They talk about it in newspaper, in the media, and with the public. So does France. I don't see the public having a meltdown. They can handle it. They're curious. And I think they feel a little more comforted that the government is actively involved and notices and cares about these unknown objects in their airspace. So I think it's time that the United States and Europe understands it's time. It's time to admit that you guys see it too. You acknowledge it's real. Whether they can answer what it is or not, we don't care. We just want to know that our government is paying attention.